She ruled for 44 years. She defeated the Spanish Armada. She forged an empire through sheer will. But when Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, died alone in Richmond Palace, her passing raised a question that remains unsolved to this day. What truly killed her? Was it age? Poison from the very makeup she wore with pride? Or was it something deeper, sorrow, loneliness, and the crushing weight of ruling alone? Tonight, journey back into history as we uncover the mysterious final days of England's most iconic queen. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and hit the bell, so you never miss a story that brings the past back to life. The year was 1603. England stood on the brink of change, yet within the cold, shadowed halls of Richmond Palace, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Elizabeth I, once the radiant Virgin Queen, a figure of power and glory, now lay frail and distant from the world she had ruled for more than 4 decades. At 69 years old, the Queen's body betrayed the spirit that had once defied kings, armies, and conspiracies. Her face, once luminous beneath layers of white makeup, had grown gaunt. Her eyes, sharp in court and fierce on the battlefield of politics, now stared blankly at nothing. Those closest to her whispered in fear and confusion. Elizabeth, so long a symbol of strength, had begun to fade. Her decline was not sudden. Over the winter months she had grown quiet and withdrawn. She slept little, refused food, and spent long hours standing in eerie silence, motionless, surrounded by anxious courtiers who dared not interrupt her solitude. There were nights when she spoke not a word, simply shaking her head when questioned. Those who loved her, or served her, knew something was gravely wrong. Some believed sorrow weighed heavily on her heart. The deaths of close friends, like the Earl of Essex who had been executed after a failed rebellion, left deep scars. Elizabeth, though always regal, had been fiercely loyal to those she loved. Loss, after loss, chipped away at her resolve. Her mind, once razor-sharp, now seemed dulled by grief. Yet others suspected a more insidious cause. For years, Elizabeth had relied on the beauty standards of her court. She had coated her face with Venetian ceruse, a white lead-based makeup used to hide blemishes and maintain her porcelain appearance. What she did not know, what no one knew then, was that lead slowly poisons the body. Prolonged use could cause fatigue, memory loss, digestive issues, and ultimately, the shutting down of organs. The signs were all there, yet no doctor of her time could connect them. Still, Elizabeth fought. She refused to take to her bed, convinced that surrendering to weakness would hasten her end. Even in her final days, she stood for hours, leaning against cushions, eyes distant, lips tightly sealed. Her legendary willpower, which had seen England through wars and political storms, remained intact. But her body could no longer match it. As March wore on, the atmosphere at court grew heavy with dread. On the 24th, as dawn broke gently over the River Thames, Elizabeth breathed her last. No great declarations, no dramatic farewells. Just quiet, a long silence where once there had been a mighty voice. Her death marked not just the end of a queen but the end of a dynasty. With no children, the Tudor line was finished. The throne would soon pass to James VI of Scotland, ushering in the Stuart age. Yet even as England prepared to move forward, one question lingered: what truly claimed Elizabeth's life? Was it grief? Poison? Age? Or had the burdens of monarchy, carried alone for so many years, finally broken even the indomitable Virgin Queen? From the moment Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, her life had been intertwined with duty. She was only 25 years old when she became Queen of England, inheriting a nation fractured by religious division, foreign threats, and bitter memories of bloodshed. Yet from her first days as monarch, she wore the crown with an unmatched combination of intellect, charisma, and cunning. But greatness always has its price. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth carefully crafted her image as the Virgin Queen, devoted solely to her kingdom. She knew that marriage, while politically advantageous, could weaken her power and tether England's fate to foreign interests. Despite pressure from advisors and foreign ambassadors, she remained resolute. she would rule alone. It was her greatest strength, and perhaps her deepest wound. Behind the regal masks and brilliant pageantry, Elizabeth's solitude was profound. Court life swirled with vibrant personalities and endless intrigues, but real companionship was rare. Those who came close often paid a price. Robert Dudley, her lifelong favorite and perhaps her truest friend, died suddenly in 1588. His death shattered her emotionally. Later, when Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, her godson and at times beloved confidant, led a rebellion against her and was executed, another piece of Elizabeth's heart crumbled. Publicly, she remained composed. Privately, she was devastated. Each loss weighed heavily, and whispers of melancholy began to circulate through the gilded halls of her court. As the years stretched on, time became a cruel adversary. Elizabeth's once celebrated beauty faded. The striking red hair turned thin and gray, hidden beneath elaborate wigs. The pale glow of her complexion became a haunting mask of powder and lead. She had been England's radiant star, but now she fought desperately to hold on to that image. Her court watched helplessly as signs of deterioration appeared. Elizabeth became increasingly irritable and suspicious. Loyal courtiers were dismissed on minor offenses, and trusted servants walked on eggshells. What had once been sharp political instinct sometimes slipped into paranoia. Then came the sleepless nights. Unable to rest, she paced her chambers for hours, refusing to sit or lie down. Sleep deprivation took a visible toll. Her memory faltered, decision-making slowed, and waves of sadness consumed her. Physicians offered remedies, tonics, poultices, and prayers, but none eased her suffering. Some blamed her decline on natural aging. Others whispered darker theories, a curse, divine punishment, or poisoning. Yet the simpler truth seemed evident to those closest to her. Elizabeth I, who had carried the burdens of leadership alone for decades, was breaking under the strain. The death of friends, the loneliness of power, the passage of time. Together, they created a slow and invisible assassin, one far more patient and cruel than any assassin's blade. Even as she grew weaker, Elizabeth refused to relinquish control. She rejected suggestions to name a successor publicly, wary of political games that could erupt upon her passing. Her iron will, which had built an empire, now prevented her from accepting the inevitable. By the winter of 1603, the court had changed. Laughter was rare. Tension hung heavy in the air. Elizabeth's retreat into silence became deeper. Courtiers gathered, worried not only for their queen but for the nation itself. Without heirs, uncertainty loomed. Inside Richmond Palace, with the weight of the crown pressing harder than ever, Elizabeth I stood alone, as she had for so long, facing the shadow of death with quiet defiance. From the moment Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, her life had been intertwined with duty. She was only 25 years old when she became Queen of England, inheriting a nation fractured by religious division, foreign threats, and bitter memories of bloodshed. Yet from her first days as monarch, she wore the crown with an unmatched combination of intellect, charisma, and cunning. But greatness always has its price. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth carefully crafted her image as the Virgin Queen, devoted solely to her kingdom. She knew that marriage, while politically advantageous, could weaken her power and tether England's fate to foreign interests. Despite pressure from advisors and foreign ambassadors, she remained resolute. She would rule alone. It was her greatest strength, and perhaps her deepest wound. Behind the regal masks and brilliant pageantry, Elizabeth's solitude was profound. Court life swirled with vibrant personalities and endless intrigues, but real companionship was rare. Those who came close often paid a price. Robert Dudley, her lifelong favorite and perhaps her truest friend, died suddenly in 1588. His death shattered her emotionally. Later, when Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, her godson and at times beloved confidant, led a rebellion against her and was executed, another piece of Elizabeth's heart crumbled. Publicly, she remained composed. Privately, she was devastated. Each loss weighed heavily, and whispers of melancholy began to circulate through the gilded halls of her court. As the years stretched on, time became a cruel adversary. Elizabeth's once celebrated beauty faded. The striking red hair turned thin and gray, hidden beneath elaborate wigs. The pale glow of her complexion became a haunting mask of powder and lead. She had been England's radiant star, but now she fought desperately to hold on to that image. Her court watched helplessly as signs of deterioration appeared. Elizabeth became increasingly irritable and suspicious. Loyal courtiers were dismissed on minor offenses, and trusted servants walked on eggshells. What had once been sharp political instinct sometimes slipped into paranoia. Then came the sleepless nights. Unable to rest, she paced her chambers for hours, refusing to sit or lie down. Sleep deprivation took a visible toll. Her memory faltered, decision-making slowed, and waves of sadness consumed her. Physicians offered remedies, tonics, poultices, and prayers, but none eased her suffering. Some blamed her decline on natural aging. Others whispered darker theories, a curse, divine punishment, or poisoning. Yet the simpler truth seemed evident to those closest to her. Elizabeth I, who had carried the burdens of leadership alone for decades, was breaking under the strain. The death of friends, the loneliness of power, the passage of time. Together, they created a slow and invisible assassin, one far more patient and cruel than any assassin's blade. Even as she grew weaker, Elizabeth refused to relinquish control. She rejected suggestions to name a successor publicly, wary of political games that could erupt upon her passing. Her iron will, which had built an empire, now prevented her from accepting the inevitable. By the winter of 1603, the court had changed. Laughter was rare. Tension hung heavy in the air. Elizabeth's retreat into silence became deeper. Courtiers gathered, worried not only for their queen but for the nation itself. Without heirs, uncertainty loomed. Inside Richmond Palace, with the weight of the crown pressing harder than ever, Elizabeth I stood alone, as she had for so long, facing the shadow of death with quiet defiance. As winter melted into early spring in 1603, the great halls of Richmond Palace grew quieter. Gone were the lively banquets, the music, and the vibrant debates that once defined Elizabeth's reign. In their place, silence reigned, broken only by the whispers of worried attendants and the Queen's own restless footsteps echoing through the corridors. Elizabeth's health, already fragile, had worsened. Those closest to her observed the disturbing changes. Her once steadfast appetite had disappeared, leaving her frail and gaunt. She refused nourishment, often going days without eating more than a few mouthfuls. Her refusal puzzled and frightened the court physicians, but they could do little to convince her otherwise. It was not merely her body that faltered, it was her mind as well. Once celebrated for her sharp tongue and unmatched intellect, Elizabeth had grown distant and distracted. She could spend hours in melancholic silence, staring into space, lost in thoughts that no one dared disturb. It was as if the weight of her memories, of triumphs, betrayals, and bitter losses, had become too heavy to bear. Her ladies-in-waiting, loyal to the end, watched helplessly. They whispered of deep sadness and confusion clouding her thoughts. Some said the Queen had been speaking to shadows, calling out to departed friends as though they still stood beside her. Others spoke of nights when she wandered her chambers restlessly, tormented by an unknown sorrow that left her exhausted but unwilling to sleep. Sleep, in fact, had become her greatest adversary. Elizabeth refused to go to bed. Night after night, she remained upright, seated on cushions or leaning against walls. She feared, some speculated, that lying down would mean surrendering to death. If she never closed her eyes, perhaps she could stave off the inevitable. Her refusal was not out of pride alone. Elizabeth had always feared showing weakness. In a world dominated by men and foreign enemies, she had learned to conceal vulnerability behind layers of strength and ceremony. Yet now, in the privacy of her final days, that mask began to slip. Doctors, limited by the medical knowledge of the time, struggled to offer solutions. Diagnoses ranged from melancholy, what we might call depression today, to age-related decline. Remedies were rudimentary at best: herbal tinctures, gentle massages, and prayers. None proved effective. Among the whispered theories, lead poisoning was never far from discussion, though unrecognized formally. The Queen had long relied on cosmetics to preserve her youthful image. Venetian ceruse, the lead-based white makeup favored by Elizabeth and many nobles, gave her that signature porcelain look. But repeated exposure to lead over decades could explain many of her symptoms: fatigue, memory loss, irritability, and a weakened immune system. By the time the Queen's condition worsened in the final weeks, it was clear she was fighting battles on multiple fronts, not just physical ailments, but the relentless erosion of her mental and emotional strength. Grief, age, toxic beauty standards, and the heavy burdens of sovereignty seemed to converge into a perfect storm. And still, Elizabeth resisted. She refused to allow her attendants to help her into bed. She waved away their gentle pleas and carried on, day after day, through sheer willpower alone. In this strange twilight between life and death, the once mighty Queen of England stood like a ghost within her own palace, a haunting reminder of how even the strongest can wither when body and mind betray them. But her end was drawing near. By March 1603, Richmond Palace had become a place of hushed tones and anxious glances. Courtiers moved carefully through the dim corridors, speaking in whispers, as though loud voices alone might hasten the Queen's departure. Outside the palace walls, London waited nervously. The people knew their beloved monarch was dying, and with her, perhaps the stability they had known for decades. Inside, Elizabeth's chamber had transformed into a solemn sanctuary. Only her most trusted attendants and physicians were allowed near. The Queen, though weakened, still resisted the final step, lying down to rest. For days she stood or slumped against cushions, too proud or too frightened to surrender. It was as though the very act of reclining would signal death to come collect her. Her attendants were heartbroken. They pleaded gently for her to take to her bed, if only to ease her obvious suffering. Yet she refused. Elizabeth, who had commanded armies, faced down the Spanish Armada, and held her throne in a world that sought to take it from her, would not bend now. Her will, even in decline, remained unbroken. As the days dragged into nights, the vigil at her side grew more intense. Physicians continued to offer useless remedies, their faces tight with worry. Ladies in waiting watched helplessly as Elizabeth's moments of lucidity became fewer and farther between. Sometimes she would slip into murmured conversations with shadows, calling names only she knew. Other times she would stare blankly, lost in a mind too burdened with memories. Among the most loyal by her side was Archbishop John Whitgift. As head of the Church of England, he recognized the gravity of the moment. He prayed softly at her bedside, seeking to comfort her and prepare her soul for what lay ahead. Elizabeth, however, offered no response. Her silence, once a powerful tool of her reign, now marked her slow withdrawal from the world. As the end neared, her household faced an urgent question, one that had haunted Elizabeth for years. Who would succeed her? The Queen had refused to officially name an heir, fearing that doing so would weaken her authority. Yet in private moments she had given subtle indications. When pressed in these final hours, she reportedly made a faint gesture, interpreted as a sign favoring James VI of Scotland, the son of her executed cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Outside her chamber, the wheels of power began turning. Advisors and statesmen quietly prepared for the transition. The union of the English and Scottish crowns, long a source of tension, now seemed inevitable. But none dared act until the Queen had passed. Her ladies kept close through the long hours, tears silently flowing as they watched the woman they had served for years drift further away. Even now, she maintained a kind of grace. There were no cries of fear or panic. No loud declarations. Only whispers, prayers, and fading breaths. In the early hours of March 24, 1603, as dawn's faint light crept across the Thames, the end came quietly. Elizabeth I, monarch, warrior, poet, and symbol of England's golden age, was gone. She died as she lived, alone at the summit of power, stubborn and proud, unwilling to show weakness even in death. The vigil ended not with fanfare, but with profound and respectful silence. Though her heart had stopped, her legacy had only just begun to take shape. In the days and weeks following Elizabeth's passing, grief swept across England. Bells tolled in every village and town. Black cloth draped windows. People wept openly in the streets. They mourned not only the death of a monarch, but the passing of an era, the Elizabethan age, which had seen unparalleled exploration, cultural brilliance, and relative stability. Yet behind closed doors, questions lingered. For all her glory, Elizabeth's death had not been noble or clear-cut. There had been no heroic last words, no grand pronouncements. Instead, she had faded away slowly, painfully, and mysteriously. Those who had attended her during her final weeks whispered about her strange symptoms and the haunting silence that had filled her chamber. Naturally, theories began to spread. What had truly caused the death of the Virgin Queen? The first and most natural explanation was simple: old age. Elizabeth had ruled for 44 years. She had outlived many of her closest contemporaries. In an era when reaching the age of 60 was rare, Elizabeth's 69 years were remarkable. Some argued that her body had simply given out. The fatigue, the sleeplessness, the mental confusion, all were seen as signs of an aging mind and body succumbing to time. But others were not satisfied with this explanation. Her slow decline had seemed unnatural to some who had known her in her younger, vigorous years. Thus, darker theories took hold. One of the most persistent centered on her cosmetic use. For decades, Elizabeth had used Venetian ceruse, a paste made of white lead and vinegar, to achieve her famously pale complexion. It was fashionable, yes, but deadly. Lead poisoning was not understood in the 16th century, but modern experts recognized the symptoms: tremors, insomnia, digestive distress, mental deterioration, and eventually organ failure. Elizabeth's symptoms, from irritability to withdrawal, from frailty to confusion, fit this pattern all too well. Then there were the rumors of melancholy, known today as depression. Elizabeth had lived through betrayals, wars, and the execution of close confidants. Her later years were marked by increasing isolation and loss. The deaths of dear friends and the absence of a husband or child left her lonely in her final days. The weight of the crown, combined with personal sorrow, may have driven her into a deep depression that hastened her physical decline. Mental anguish, in those times, was poorly understood but deadly in its own way. Still, more sinister whispers spread among the people. Some believed Elizabeth had been poisoned by enemies. Even in old age, she had no shortage of foes, both domestic and foreign. Catholic conspirators, still bitter over England's break with Rome, had plotted against her for decades. Could one of them have succeeded at last? There was, however, no evidence of foul play. No suspicious food or sudden collapse. Her decline had been slow and painful, not quick and violent as poisonings typically were. Finally, there was the spiritual and superstitious explanation, popular among the common folk. Some whispered of divine punishment. Elizabeth had executed Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic, years earlier. Her refusal to marry or bear an heir, seen by many as unnatural, fueled tales of a curse. These superstitions, while not grounded in fact, reflected the fears and beliefs of an age still ruled by mystery as much as reason. As days turned into months, no clear answer emerged. Doctors of the time could only list vague causes like decline or natural causes. Yet the debate did not die with her. Historians, scientists, and scholars continue to discuss Elizabeth's death to this day, piecing together clues from records, letters, and eyewitness accounts. In the absence of certainty, one truth remains undeniable. Elizabeth's final battle was as complex and shadowed as the reign she had so fiercely commanded. Whether felled by age, poison, grief, or a cruel combination of them all, her death remains a puzzle, wrapped in the same enigmatic power that defined her life. Centuries after Elizabeth's death, the mystery surrounding her final days continued to fascinate scholars and medical historians. As science advanced and the toxic properties of certain substances became widely known, renewed attention fell on the Queen's extensive use of cosmetics, and particularly Venetian ceruse. In Elizabeth's era, pale skin was not only fashionable but political. It represented nobility, wealth, and freedom from the outdoor labor of peasants. To maintain her famous alabaster complexion, Elizabeth, like many aristocrats of her time, applied layer upon layer of this lead-based makeup. What she and her contemporaries did not realize, however, was that lead, when absorbed into the skin and bloodstream over years, could slowly and silently poison the body. Modern medical analysis suggests that long-term lead poisoning could explain many of the Queen's late-life ailments. Chronic exposure often leads to a gradual decline, fatigue, weakness, tremors, gastrointestinal issues, memory loss, irritability, and eventually organ failure. By the time of her death, Elizabeth displayed almost all these symptoms. Though her physicians had no understanding of toxicology, they observed her worsening condition with growing alarm. Notes from her attendants mention her irritability, confusion, persistent insomnia, and severe loss of appetite, all potential signs of heavy metal toxicity. Combined with the stress and sorrow she carried, lead poisoning may well have played a major role in her decline. However, science alone does not explain everything. In Elizabeth's case, psychological stress and profound emotional trauma likely intertwined with her physical ailments. She had faced immense pressure during her reign. Her refusal to marry, though a political strategy, had left her isolated. She was the last Tudor monarch, carrying the burden of securing Protestant England's future on her shoulders. Every decision she made was scrutinized, every misstep magnified. In her later years, this isolation deepened. She had lost her closest companions. Robert Dudley, perhaps the love of her life, had died more than a decade earlier. Her advisor and mentor, William Cecil, was gone. Even the younger favorites, like the Earl of Essex, ended in tragedy. These losses cut deeply. Historians have long noted how loneliness and melancholy marked her final years. Depression, in the modern sense, was not something Elizabeth's physicians would have diagnosed. But its symptoms were visible. She withdrew from social engagements, avoided decision-making, and fell into prolonged silences. The once eloquent and commanding Queen became quiet and withdrawn. This emotional exhaustion, paired with lead toxicity, likely hastened her decline. In the years following her death, no official autopsy was ever conducted. The exact cause of death, therefore, went unrecorded. Contemporary reports simply stated that she died peacefully after a period of physical decline. In the absence of modern medicine, that was enough. The people mourned, and the nation moved forward under King James I. Yet for historians today, her death remains an unsolved puzzle. Could she have lived longer had she not relied on poisonous beauty standards? Would companionship and emotional support have prolonged her reign? Or was the burden of the crown itself, a lifetime spent balancing power, religion, war, and betrayal, always destined to consume her in the end? The theories are many, but one conclusion unites them all. Elizabeth's death was not caused by a single blow, but by the slow, relentless erosion of mind, body, and spirit. She had ruled alone. And in the end, she died much the same way, quietly, tragically, and shrouded in uncertainty. In the days immediately following Elizabeth's death, all of England seemed suspended in quiet mourning. News spread quickly, carried from village to village by word of mouth and by royal messengers. The Virgin Queen, the ruler who had guided the nation for nearly half a century, was gone. And though her passing had been slow and somber, the nation's grief was sudden and deep. Inside the royal court, preparations began for what would be one of the grandest and most symbolic farewells in English history. Elizabeth I would be given a funeral befitting her legendary reign, a monarch who had defeated the Spanish Armada, championed the arts, and maintained peace and stability in an age of turmoil. Yet even as the great wheels of ceremony began to turn, those closest to her felt a personal and painful loss. To her ladies-in-waiting and loyal servants, Elizabeth's death was not only the end of a political era, it was the loss of a woman they had loved and revered. These were the people who had stood silently by her side in those final, restless days, watching as she refused to yield even to death itself. As tradition demanded, her body was embalmed and placed in a lead-lined coffin. For several weeks, she lay in state at Whitehall Palace, where the nobility and citizens of London came to pay their respects. Cloaked in regal splendor, surrounded by tapestries and candles, Elizabeth's mortal remains became a symbol of everything her reign had stood for: dignity, power, and poise even in death. On April 28, 1603, more than a month after her passing, London witnessed one of the most solemn processions in its history. At dawn, the bells began to toll. Church towers across the city echoed with deep, slow chimes that mourned the passing of a queen and an age. A great funeral cortege, stretching for nearly a mile, made its way slowly from Whitehall to Westminster Abbey. Leading the procession were heralds, nobles, and knights, followed by the royal household dressed in mourning black. Behind them came a majestic funeral carriage draped in black velvet, drawn by 4 horses, also covered in black cloth. Atop the coffin rested a life-sized effigy of Elizabeth, a wax figure dressed in royal robes and a crown, holding a scepter and orb. This was the final image of the queen the people would see. Though the real Elizabeth lay lifeless within, the figure represented her eternal power. As the carriage passed, thousands of mourners lined the streets in silent reverence. Some wept openly, while others bowed or crossed themselves as the queen made her final journey. The funeral service at Westminster Abbey was steeped in symbolism and grandeur. Bishops and clergy chanted solemn prayers. Nobles gathered in hushed sorrow. The abbey itself, which Elizabeth had visited often during her life, became the setting for her last rites. She was interred in the Lady Chapel, close to her half-sister and once rival, Mary I. Ironically, the 2 daughters of Henry VIII, who had fought for power and religious supremacy, would now rest side by side for eternity. With the closing of her tomb, the Tudor dynasty ended. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, uniting the thrones of England and Scotland under a new name, James I of England. The political chapter closed, but the cultural and historical legacy of Elizabeth began to take on a life of its own. For the people of England, her passing was more than the death of a monarch. It was the farewell to an age of splendor, discovery, and profound national identity. In her lifetime, Elizabeth had been a queen. In death, she became a legend. As the heavy stone closed over Elizabeth's tomb, the kingdom she had ruled with iron resolve entered an uncertain new era. Her death did not merely leave a vacancy on the throne, it left a void in the nation's collective spirit. For nearly half a century, Elizabeth had been the only monarch many of her subjects had ever known. Her image had become intertwined with England itself, steadfast, majestic, and resilient. Yet monarchies cannot pause for grief. Even before Elizabeth's body was laid to rest, the delicate matter of succession had been set in motion. Though she had never formally named her heir in public, her gestures in her final days, combined with long-understood diplomatic understandings, paved the way for James VI of Scotland to inherit the throne. The news of James's accession spread quickly. He was proclaimed James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland in what would come to be known as the Union of the Crowns. The smoothness of this transition surprised many, especially in a kingdom rife with religious divisions and political rivalries. But Elizabeth's careful, if silent, handling of the succession had done its job. The kingdom did not fracture. Civil war, which had seemed a possibility during moments of uncertainty in her reign, never materialized. Still, the shadow of Elizabeth loomed large. James, though eager to take possession of his new realm, faced the impossible task of following a legend. Elizabeth had ruled alone, forging her own path and style of leadership. She had kept powerful nobles at bay, balanced foreign powers, and infused the monarchy with charisma and almost mythic presence. James, scholarly and pragmatic but lacking Elizabeth's magnetism, found himself compared to her at every turn. For the people of England, the change was palpable. James was foreign in many ways. His Scottish accent, different court customs, and more subdued style felt alien after decades of Elizabethan grandeur. Londoners, so accustomed to Elizabeth's regal processions and public displays, found his first entrances to the city underwhelming. He preferred the quieter life of his private chambers to the open handshakes and grand speeches Elizabeth had mastered. At court, old loyalties clung stubbornly to Elizabeth's memory. Courtiers who had risen under her struggled to adjust to James's new order. Some were replaced. Others faded into obscurity. The age of the Virgin Queen was over, and with it, the rituals and hierarchies she had carefully crafted. Religiously, too, James faced challenges. Elizabeth had delicately balanced Protestant England against Catholic Europe. While her religious settlement had its critics, she maintained relative peace. James, though a Protestant himself, lacked Elizabeth's finesse in managing sectarian tensions. In time, this would contribute to conflicts that Elizabeth had managed, through sheer force of personality and policy, to keep simmering rather than boiling over. Culturally, however, Elizabeth's reign remained vibrant even after her passing. Playwrights, poets, and musicians still celebrated the Elizabethan legacy. William Shakespeare, who had written many of his greatest plays during her rule, paid homage to her enduring presence in the national psyche. The arts world, which had flourished under Elizabeth's patronage, carried forward the spirit of her court even as new political realities emerged. Despite the smooth transfer of power, Elizabeth's memory haunted James. He privately remarked on the enormity of replacing such a figure, and he would often express frustration at being overshadowed by his predecessor. Though James would go on to leave his own mark, including commissioning the famous King James Bible, he always ruled in the shadow of the Queen who had made England a power of global stature. The Virgin Queen had departed, but her spirit remained woven into the very fabric of English identity. Her successor might sit on the throne, but Elizabeth's reign still lingered, casting a long and unshakable shadow across the new Stuart age. In the months and years after Elizabeth's burial, something remarkable began to happen. The Queen, who had once stood alone in silent chambers, tormented by sorrow and sickness, began to transform in the minds of her people. The harsh realities of her final days faded. In their place emerged a myth, one destined to endure through centuries. Elizabeth I became more than history. She became legend. It began subtly. Artists, poets, and playwrights elevated her image. No longer was she remembered as the frail old woman who refused her bed or the lonely sovereign tormented by memories. Instead, Elizabeth became immortalized as Gloriana, the majestic, near-divine ruler who brought stability and greatness to England. Her wrinkles and weaknesses vanished in portraits commissioned after her death. Instead, she was painted radiant, ageless, clothed in armor or shimmering gowns, representing triumph, wisdom, and national pride. In many ways, this transformation was inevitable. Elizabeth had ruled during a remarkable time. Under her reign, England defeated the Spanish Armada, established global trade routes, and fostered a golden age of culture. The works of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser flourished. Her court had dazzled Europe with its splendor and intellect. People needed, to remember this age as glorious. And so Elizabeth, even in death, became its symbol. Yet the mythology went further than mere flattery. Elizabeth came to embody the very idea of England itself. At a time when Europe was dominated by powerful kings and the ever-present threat of Catholic monarchies, she had ruled alone, a woman in a man's world. Her refusal to marry became recast not as stubbornness or calculation, but as divine dedication to her nation. She had wed herself, so the myth said, to England alone. Political motives also shaped this posthumous elevation. James I, though respectful, faced resistance from those who still clung to the Tudor legacy. Celebrating Elizabeth became a subtle form of nostalgia and sometimes quiet protest against the new Stuart rule. As conflicts grew under James and later Charles I, Elizabeth's reign began to look increasingly golden in contrast to the troubled Stuart years that followed. Her myth also proved useful for later generations. During England's struggles with France and Spain in the centuries to come, Elizabeth's defiant image was resurrected again and again. Paintings of the Queen with her hand on a globe or surrounded by symbols of empire became rallying icons during times of war and expansion. She became the eternal defender of England's honor. But myths, by their nature, simplify. The true Elizabeth, complex, shrewd, sometimes ruthless, became obscured beneath layers of romanticism. The woman who executed rivals, imprisoned Mary, Queen of Scots, and ruled with occasional cruelty was largely forgotten by the public. What remained was the image of the Virgin Queen, serene, noble, and eternally wise. Even in popular culture today, Elizabeth's myth continues. Films, books, and television often portray her as the ultimate Renaissance queen, brilliant, brave, and visionary. Few stories linger on her paranoia, her loneliness, or the physical and emotional pains that consumed her final days. In many ways, Elizabeth herself helped craft this myth. Throughout her reign, she had used pageantry, portraits, and poetry to shape how her people saw her. In life, it was a political tool. In death, it became her legacy. By the time England moved deeper into the 17th century, the real Elizabeth had faded almost entirely from view. What remained was something far larger. The idea of Elizabeth as eternal sovereign, guardian of the realm, and golden figure of an age that many remembered, perhaps falsely, as perfect. Centuries have passed since Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, breathed her last in the quiet chambers of Richmond Palace. Yet, despite the passing of time and the advances of science and medicine, the true cause of her death remains elusive. What truly killed Elizabeth I? Historians, doctors, and scholars have debated this question for generations, and perhaps they always will. At first glance, age alone seems a likely answer. Elizabeth was 69 when she died, remarkable longevity for a monarch in the early 17th century. Many of her contemporaries never reached such years. The simple wear and tear of decades lived at the summit of power, coupled with inevitable physical decline, might seem explanation enough. But her death was neither swift nor serene. It was long, drawn out, and fraught with troubling symptoms. Insomnia plagued her. Her appetite failed. She sank deep into depression. Her mind clouded, and her body weakened. These signs hint at something more than age. They suggest the possibility of a cumulative poisoning, both of the body and spirit. Modern medicine has shed light on the silent killer that may have shared her mirror for years. Lead poisoning. Venetian ceruse, that chalky white cosmetic she applied religiously to mask the passage of time, was laced with deadly lead. Years, even decades, of exposure could lead to chronic health problems, neurological decline, kidney failure, mood disorders, and a weakened immune system. Elizabeth displayed many such symptoms in her later years. Her famous beauty may have, ironically, hastened her downfall. Equally potent, though less visible, was emotional and psychological strain. For over 4 decades, Elizabeth ruled alone. She had no husband to share the burdens of monarchy, no children to offer comfort in her old age. Friends and confidants slowly slipped away through death or betrayal. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, haunted her. The death of her beloved Robert doubly devastated her. The Essex rebellion wounded her deeply. By the time her health began to fail, she was surrounded by few intimates. Loneliness hung heavy in her final months. Historians today widely believe that her decline was the result of multiple, interwoven factors. Lead poisoning, age, grief, and depression, none alone fully explain her drawn-out demise, but together, they weave a tapestry of slow and inevitable deterioration. But while debates about the cause of death continue, they seem almost secondary to what Elizabeth left behind. In many ways, her death was overshadowed by her life. The Elizabethan age, with its poetry, drama, sea voyages, and political brilliance, became a golden legend. Elizabeth herself, reborn through art and memory, became more than a monarch. She became an idea, the woman who ruled alone and embodied the spirit of her people. Her successors would struggle to live up to this legacy. The Stuarts, though inheritors of her crown, could never quite command the same affection or mythic stature. Even centuries later, Elizabeth's reign remains the standard by which English monarchs are judged. What killed Elizabeth I? Perhaps it was age, poison, sorrow, or all three. But in truth, death never fully claimed her. Her body may have been laid to rest, but her story lives on, immortalized in portraits, plays, and the collective memory of a nation. In her life, she was Queen of England. In her death, she became England itself. Her death was quiet. Her legacy eternal. Elizabeth I left no heirs, but she left something even greater, an age named after her, and a story still told centuries later. Was she claimed by poison, sorrow, or simply time itself? We may never know for certain. But one truth remains: when the Virgin Queen passed, an era passed with her. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more journeys into history's greatest mysteries. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think truly caused the death of Elizabeth I? Until next time, stay curious.